From the White House to the convent. We have a wonderful guest for you today, folks. Martina Purdy, most well known as being BBC NI political correspondent throughout the back end, I suppose, the culmination of the conflict period here in Northern Ireland, the end of the Troubles, effectively, with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Ushering in a new kind of chapter in our shared history here, this part of the world, as we enter the peace process, which still continues now. And we've got many challenges that come with that, and it's always kind of evolving. But that's where we are now. And Martina was really at the center of things throughout so many different significant events in our history here, as BBC NI political correspondent. God, however, had different challenges and different things in store for Martina as she felt a calling and left her world of political journalism in 2014 and joined the Sisters of Adoration Convent in 2014. Stayed with them for 5 years and very unexpectedly was released after 5 years, after she was informed that the convent, the Sisters of Adoration, had effectively become too small. The structures were too fragile and vulnerable, and they needed to close things down. So things have taken a different turn in Martina's life. Now she's a lay person, working, doing some work with the St. Patrick's Centre in Downpatrick here in County Down, and has recently, along with her her close friend and someone who's been on the journey with her, a lady who was a barrister, and then also joined the Sisters of Adoration Convent in Elaine Kelly. And the two of them are actually doing a Camino-inspired walk now in Downpatrick throughout the town of Downpatrick, I suppose, where St. Patrick, his grave is, and there's a St. Patrick's Cathedral there. So yeah, really interesting conversation. We kind of go through the journey that Martina's been on so far, and then also we kind of just touch on different contemporary issues. So if you enjoy the show, I would encourage you to subscribe and share it with anyone that might gain some value from it. And for more authentic conversations and challenging information like we'll get into today, yeah, you know what to do. Hit that bell button and subscribe. Anyway, enjoy the show. Really interesting journey that Martina's been on. Martina, thanks so much for coming on. How are you?
I'm great, Luke. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a delight to be here and talk to you. It's great to see a young Catholic.
Yeah.
Kind of getting scarcer. We need to bring kind of your generation back.
Yeah,
well, that's fantastic what you're doing.
It's kind of what I'm starting to try and move back towards myself. So I don't think I need any credit. Like I have a lot more kind of learning to do and need a head.
Well, that's what.
Sorry, go
Sorry
ahead.
to interrupt. Well, the word disciple means learner, so we're all in that boat.
Didn't even know that. Every day's a school day, but absolutely. So I suppose, Martina, we'll start at the start. I think growing up, you know, whenever I first would have come across you watching television, and I'll just be completely honest here, I think the first things that I would have thought of, wrong in so many different levels, were who's that American lady and why is she so interested in politics in Northern Ireland? So first of all, apologies to all Canadians out there, because the accent was completely lost on me as a kid. But and then I subsequently realized, or I've learned since, that you're from here, you're from Belfast originally, and then you moved to Canada before returning sometime later. So yeah, I suppose first of all, how come your family ended up moving to Canada? And if you'd just like to tell us a bit about your time there and why it is that you ended up returning to Belfast.
Yeah, a friend of mine was in Toronto with me after I left the convent and asked one of my mom's friends who was from Belfast, what brought you to Toronto? And she said, are you kidding? What else? The Troubles? It's the same that for everyone who kind of ended up in Toronto from Belfast in the 1970s, there was a huge wave of people. And I suppose, well, I was only about 5.5, and we were living in Ladybrook in West Belfast, and I was attending Holy Child School. And my father was English. He had been a soldier pre-Troubles doing his national service at Hollywood Barracks in the early 60s. He was conscripted, you know, he had to do 2 years. And while he was here, he met my mom at a dance. And so they ended up living in West Belfast, getting married, living in West Belfast, 3 kids. Troubles broke out. My father's background being kind of in the army probably made him vulnerable. And they decided to emigrate. And Chichester Clark had resigned. And my dad said, let's get out of here. There's going to be a bloodbath. So we ended up in Toronto. And that was in March 1971. And I always wanted to come back to Belfast. And I did at the first opportunity.
Wow. So had you done journalism whenever you were in Toronto, or was it only whenever you returned here that you started doing it?
Well, what happened, I wanted to be a journalist, but a friend of mine whose wife was a journalist said, you really should not go straight to journalism school because you're only 18. You should go and do an undergraduate, get a degree, and then you'll know something about something. And then you can be a bit more mature and you can go to journalism school. So I took that advice and I did an undergraduate at the University of Toronto in international relations. And then I decided I would come back to Belfast and try to break into journalism. But you really needed the qualifications. That was in 1987. And I thought I might have to go back to Toronto when I got a job as a telesalesperson in the Irish News. And that was around the autumn of 87. And through that, I started kind of making friends in the newsroom with the features editor, Dave Colbert, who's now deceased, to get me off his back, gave me a book to review. And that gave me some kind of clippings that I could return to Toronto with and present to a journalism course. So I applied to the Ryerson School of Journalism around 1989. And I worked for a year to get the money together. And I worked for the Directors Guild of Canada, which was kind of interesting, although the job itself was kind of dull. I was doing the contracts for films that were being made in Toronto. So I think, it was interesting to see these films being made. And from there, I entered journalism school and I did 2 years at Ryerson and came back to Belfast. In between, I kind of, as a journalism student, I had got an internship with the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail. And I'd also done some training with the Irish News. And so I came back and the only job I could get was the business correspondence job at the Irish News, which I didn't really want, but I needed a job. I wanted to just do straight news, but I took it and it was really interesting.
Yeah, it's good to be, like, I think it was Winston Churchill said, if you're not liberal by the time you're 20, you haven't got a heart. If you're not conservative by the time you're 30, you haven't got a brain. And whenever I think of myself, whenever I was 18 or 21 or 24, the amount that you learn in that period just through by being on planet Earth, and taking different experiences, it's probably just as well that you took a bit of you didn't just go straight in whenever you were 18 to doing political journalism type thing because I don't know. I think that it's just good to have more of a range of exposure before you head into more of the political scene. It gives you more of an idea of, or what are your thoughts?
It was good. I think at 18, I would have been really young. At 27, I had become, maybe 30, I was the business editor of the Belfast Telegraph, and I looked very young. So people would say, how old are you? Are you old enough to have this job? So I think it was a good thing to be a little bit older. I got a good grounding. I got a good education at the University of Toronto. I got a little bit involved in politics. My father used to call me a communist. I would say I was more like Dorothy Day. Kind of, I remember going on protest marches and things for the bomb. And I wasn't a big fan of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan at the time. Mm-hmm. And I remember also I was on the anti-apartheid committee, didn't have that much time, but I had a pretty busy university life because I was also working part-time to pay the tuition. But it was character building. It was hard, but I'm glad I did it. And I learned a lot. And so when I came back here, I was really interested in covering the Troubles. Mm-hmm. But what I found when I eventually did cover the Troubles, and that really was largely the Belfast Telegraph, I started as a political correspondent, was promoted 1996. Actually, it was April Fool's Day, 1996. So I look back, I think, Lord, you have a real sense of humor. So I started in that job, but after the Good Friday Agreement was signed, I had to cover the Omagh bombing. I was stringing for the LA Times as well as working for the Belfast Telegraph. And it was horrendous. So I know from that experience that I wouldn't have been able to do. I wouldn't have been able to cover the troubles. I would have been, I just found it really traumatic. And I'm full of admiration for those journalists who covered it in the 70s and the 80s to the 90s. Because it's not easy, but obviously they had the grace for it. They could do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking back on well, I suppose that chapter in your life, working then with BBC as the political correspondent, do you look back at those years fondly, and do you miss it at all, that type of work?
I look back on it and I think I'm so grateful that I had this amazing journey. And when I was young, that's what I wanted. I wanted to be a political correspondent, and I was passionate about politics. And I was interested in writing, and it was exciting when I first started getting your name in the paper. And after a while, that wasn't such a big deal. And I applied for the BBC, thinking I wouldn't really get it, but it's good to kind of show that you are willing at some point to move, because I really liked print. But I got the job, and I was kind of thrown in at the deep end. I knew the politics, but I was quite nervous about the TV, and I think everything just moved very quickly. And I'd been, working for the BBC in the middle of the political crisis. I was, I think, getting up at 7, starting work, finishing sometimes at 2 and 3 in the morning, and it was quite intense. But if God was calling me to proclaim the good news, all I heard was news, and that was my passion. And I got everything I wanted, but ultimately I realized there was more to life, and I started to get this call. And I struggled with it because I did enjoy my job. I mean, it was a great job. Most people in journalism, there's not a lot of correspondence jobs. People take them and they stay in them until they die or retire. And it was really interesting. And as a journalist, I saw some amazing places, and I was the first journalist from Northern Ireland to go into China on a trade mission. I was with the Belfast Telegraph, and so I was the only woman traveling with all these businessmen from Northern Ireland, and they were going to Beijing and Jilin province, and it was really interesting. I covered the Good Friday Agreement. I covered John Hume's and David Trimble's ceremony at Oslo. And I was in the White House and Windsor Castle, Downing Street. I had a really privileged ringside seated history, is what I've always said. But ultimately, when I realized that God was calling me, and I was sure of that, and I pondered it, and when I realized what I was being offered, there was no comparison, and I left. And the day I left the BBC, it was easy. Just walked out with so much joy, and I let go of everything. And St. Paul says all these things that he let go of were so much rubbish if he could only have Christ. And once you've tasted Christ and you've tasted the joy of God and the beauty of God, and you realize that love, and you just want to go on that adventure deeper and deeper and deeper into God. And so it was a no-brainer to enter the convent, even though when I was standing outside the convent, was actually 2 doors down from Sinn Féin headquarters on Sebastopol Street. And I never thought, as I stood on that street corner so many years at Bobby Sands mural waiting for Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, that I would be in a convent next door. But we have a God of surprises. And so, it was the best decision I ever made, leaving the BBC to go to the convent.
So. I mean, I'm guessing it just wasn't an overnight thing. Like, was it quite a long period? Did you always have a strong Catholic faith? Were you always close with God, or was it something that kind of developed more in that period towards your, like, how long was that period of transitioning of your heart, I suppose, to God, and then making that decision?
Well, I do think I got my call at baptism, but I think I had a call within a call, and that nothing is kind of wasted in God. And so that time as a journalist was training in communication for the next part of my life. So everything I learned at the BBC, I'm still using in my vocation to communicate the life of Christ. But to answer your question, I mean, I was what the Americans call a cradle Catholic. So my father was a convert from Church of England, and my mother was very devout Catholic. And so we were raised in the faith. Say my mother preached, my father practiced. He was a great example of going to Mass. My mother would be someone who went to Mass every day when she could. And so the faith was kind of, and I went to Catholic school, so I always believed in God. I have never not believed in God. And as a child, I had the Book of the Saints, and my mother had my three brothers and I around the bed, praying the rosary, and like a typical child, you were like, oh gosh, and now we have the litany, and you just wanted to kind of go do something else sometimes, but it was good for us, and I learned a lot. But we had a Bible in our house, but it was kind of on the shelf, like most Catholic homes, this big, thick, leather-bound, fancy Bible. We didn't really crack it open regularly, although my parents would quote from it, and you got your living word, the word of God, at Mass. But I wanted to be a good Catholic, and I always prayed, but it's like anyone else in their 20s, they start to question aspects of the faith. So yes, I believed in God, but did I agree with that aspect of Catholicism? Not really. Didn't really like this bit, and definitely not going for that bit. And so my brother would call me the a la carte Catholic, and kind of, so as I grew, I would say that I grew away from the tenets of the Catholic Church, but I still had a faith, and I knew that I failed miserably. But I prayed, to the Lord, saying, oh, help me to be better. And I suppose it was really only when I was about probably late 30s, after my dad died, early 40s, I started to really go into my faith and to pray a lot. And I started to read this book, and it was about prayer, and I just started to, people maybe passing me in the street, and I would ask Jesus to bless them. And it made me really happy. And the more I did that, doors started to open. And one of the things I did is I went on holiday to Peru, and, I was buying way too much stuff in my life. I was quite materialistic. I liked nice clothes, nice things, nice holidays, nice hotels. And I'd gone to Peru with a friend of mine, and we were staying in a very nice hotel, going to nice restaurants in what was effectively a very poor country. And my mother had named me after St. Martin de Porres. And I'd gone to the church where there's a shrine to him in Lima, and I felt bad about my life. I just said, this life is just so shallow. It's all about me. These poor people have nothing, and I have so much. And I felt quite ashamed about that, and I wanted to change. And I asked God to help me change. I didn't have in mind that I would be a Catholic sister, but I thought maybe I would eventually give up my job at the BBC and go and do some aid work or something that really brought more meaning to my life. But after I prayed that prayer to change, things started to really change. Doors started to open about doing charity work, and I thought, oh, is that enough, Lord? Is that what you want? I'll do this for you, but I didn't want to give everything until I knew that's really what he was asking.
So a few things you mentioned there, which I just clicked with me. One, you mentioned that you had a Bible at home, but most Catholic families, would have a Bible at home. This is my baptism Bible. I think it sat there for 27 years before I opened it for the first time, and there was actually a message from my godmother that was in it that I'd never even read because I'd never opened it. Same sort of idea. But as well, so your dad actually converted to Catholicism. One thing I've noticed, just from doing a few different videos on faith and some wonderful people making comments and engaging on YouTube. One thing I've noticed is converts to Catholicism know so much more about Catholicism than Catholics. Like, as a Catholic growing up in Belfast in the 90s and early 2000s, I think Catholicism for most kids meant that you supported Celtic, you were maybe involved with GAA football, you thought it was cool to vote for Sinn Féin. That was pretty much it, But it's funny that converts have that much more understanding about all the nuances of faith. You said that you also, whenever you were younger, had a book on the saints. Like, I've had 14 years worth of Catholic education here. And other than doing RE at A level, where we had a module on the history of the Celtic Church in Ireland, other than that, and had I not done that specific subject, other than possibly St. Patrick in one of our history classes, I pretty much know nothing about any of the saints. So in terms of, there's clearly something not right there in terms of the way in which our faith, our youth is educated in the Catholic faith. Do you have any thoughts on this? And I suppose linked in with that, do you think that teaching of the faith should come as a primary from the church, or from schools, or from the household, or just a mix, or where's the...
Well, it's definitely not coming from the schools, because I can see what's the result of what is meant to be a Catholic education. And the people I meet who've gone through a Catholic education, they don't know about the faith. And for myself, like, I got a better grounding. I went to convent school, but again, it wasn't enough. And going back to my father wasn't sure that he had a faith, but he took his instruction at Clonard Monastery in West Belfast to please my mother so they could get married. And he's prayed that if he didn't have a strong faith, that his children would. So I got a lot of my faith from my family, from my mom, especially. She was like a walking catechesis. But generally speaking, I think converts choose the faith, so because they choose it, they want to know about it, and they have to go through a course. When you're born into it, it's kind of taken for granted. Now, I knew what the Catholic faith preached. Mostly I knew the tenets of the faith, but I didn't know why. I couldn't tell you why we believe that Mary is the Immaculate Conception. And if someone had said to me, well, explain that, and sure, it's not in the Bible, I would have been probably tied up in knots. And what I have learned is that the catechesis that we are providing people, we're not catechizing them. And what's happened is pre-Vatican II, and you can see now yourself that there's a whole generation that has left the church. And when you go to Mass, it tends to be a lot of older people and fewer families. And what happened was the culture, when I was growing up in the 70s, the culture supported going to Mass. Most people believed in God, and most people went to church of some kind. But the culture is now so secular, so kind of anti-God, and it doesn't really support church going. So people don't feel the need to go, and they don't know, they don't feel frightened. And so the old ways of maybe frightening someone, that if you don't go here and sit here for 1 hour a week, you might go to hell. That's no way to encourage people into what we need is a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And it's only through that personal relationship that people will really be on fire with the faith and will understand that they will actually want to be in Mass on a Sunday and other days, and be there with a great deal of joy, instead of some of the zombies that you see sitting beside you and you're like, why are you here? And it's not their fault. They've come, they have a faith, but it hasn't penetrated a surface. And I thought that I had a deep faith until I went deeper. And I realized actually I was on the surface, and I didn't understand and know God. And obviously he's knowable, but I only know a tiny bit. I know a little drop in an infinite ocean, but that little drop, it's amazing.
Yeah. In terms of then, do you have any ideas about, what we should be doing more, what we should be doing less of, or taking a different approach in terms of not just youth, but there's clearly been like numerous generations now of moving away from faith. So yeah, do you have any thoughts or recommendations in terms of how we can fix this, how we can strengthen faith and move a kind of new generation of people to God.
Well, I'm reading this amazing book called Divine Renovation by a Canadian, Scottish Canadian priest called Father James Mallon, who's actually gone a bit global, like Bishop Robert Barron. And he talks about what's wrong with the church. And he says, look, we've heard all about the faith crisis, the vocations crisis, the sex abuse crisis. There's a crisis for everything, you name it. But the real crisis in the church, he said, is an identity crisis. The church doesn't know what it's for. When Jesus left, he told his apostles, go and make disciples, go and make learners. And what we have is a church that really hasn't been doing that, because the culture supported church going. They didn't really need to explain to people in depth their catechism, the good news. The good news is Jesus. He loves you and has an amazing plan for your life. Now, when I was growing up, if someone mentioned, are you saved, or does God, what do you think of Jesus? You'd be like, oh gosh, this person is a fanatic, this person is actually where every Catholic should be. And I remember people would say, oh, so-and-so should be a priest, but actually, no, that person wasn't called to the priesthood. They were just where every Catholic should be. And the problem we have is that a childhood catechesis that you might have got, and I got, is not going to sustain an adult life. It is not going to sustain you when you face a crisis, or when you're given a moral choice. And so we need to continually catechize, continually form people, that this commitment to being a Catholic or being a Christian, that commitment is lifelong. It's a lifelong relationship with Jesus Christ, who you follow and you learn from, and you learn to be what? A great lover. But the world's idea of being a great lover is all, sexual performance, when in fact, the ancient Greeks had 7 words for love. We have 1. That's another problem with our culture. We have 1 word for love. I love my coffee. I love my girlfriend till I find somebody better. I love my kids, but not anymore, because I found this really amazing new thing that I can go off and ignore them. So love, our language for love right now is really wrapped up in personal satisfaction, what it does for me. And it means we objectify other people. But love, Christ's love, is self-sacrificing. It's the cross. And, everybody wants to run from that, including the disciples, the apostles. But the cross is where the grace is. And so as you go deeper into Christ, and you learn that that's where the grace is. And that it's redemptive. People say, oh, why did we get COVID? And as on a very kind of superficial level, COVID, you would say, is bad. It's bad, it's killing people, and why would God do that? And I'm not saying that God is sending COVID because some people think it's man-made, but there's 2 different ways of seeing God's will. There's what he asks, what he wants, which is everyone to live in harmony and community, and what he allows. So he allows us to make our choices because he doesn't want robots. So we make choices. COVID, on one hand, ostensibly it's bad, but in a longer term look at it, looking at it from a different direction, is there some good that can come out of this? There's suffering involved, but in the longer term, is there some good where we come to see that the meaning of our life is not all about work, chasing a bigger house, chasing a better job? Actually, people, I think, have learned a lot during this crisis. And I'm not recommending it. I'm not saying it's a punishment from God, but is it bad, or is it something that is positive in another way?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's been an opportunity this last, more than 12 months now, to reflect on your priorities. Certainly, like, even growing in faith, it's been a wonderful opportunity for me, because whenever you're commuting to work, working long, heavy hours, commuting back, fitting in a couple of other things in between with doing some sort of training or socializing or whatever, you've very few hours in the day and little energy left outside of slouching down on the couch and watching TV to kind of develop this relationship and with God. And it takes time. Like, I'm just looking here at penny catechism I went through for the first time there a few weeks ago, and all of these small incremental little things that, you know, you're adding strings to your bow. It all takes time. It all takes time to reflect as well as doing it directly, you know, and just in all sorts of different elements of life. I think that people have, like, the pace of life has slowed down throughout this last year. Even faith aside, you know, people are just generally thinking, well, maybe I actually don't want to live in the city. I kind of want to be out in the fresh air more. And, you know, I want to spend more time with loved ones, be they friends, family, or whatever. So, no, certainly, you know, there have been silver linings and positives to the kind of crazy things that are happening in the world over this last year. But just to touch on something that you mentioned just before we started recording, because I think it links in with, so you mentioned there that towards the end of your time working in journalism, you kind of felt that you adopted a bit of a like me type approach, in terms of being materialistic and things like this. And I certainly would have. I had a very similar experience, basically in like my mid 20s. You know, you're starting to get a decent job, getting paid more, getting a lot more money, disposable income for spending on drink and messing about and different things, holidays like similar to yourself and things like this. But also then after the kind of novelty, you know, finished, kind of starting to reflect and realizing, hang on, not actually that happy, not, you know, and you have this kind of knowledge deep in your core that I should be doing something else. I'm meant to do something else and live in a slightly different way. And I think as well, I know now that it's Mental Health Week as well, just coincidentally today. I think that a lot of our problems in society in terms of developing mental health come from this kind of me, YOLO kind of selfish approach to life. We are constantly trying to chase the next thing, and it's all about me at the expense of others and things like this, and relationships and whatever else. But just before we started recording, you mentioned that prayer is the ultimate kind of remedy for anxiety. Would you like to elaborate on that a bit?
Well, I sometimes, when I was on Twitter during the lockdown, and I would see people I actually knew professionally saying, "Oh, I'm really anxious. I'm really anxious." And I thought, gosh, will I give them the antidote to this? The antidote is prayer. And people, when they're feeling anxious, will look for a distraction. So they might turn on the TV, they might have a glass of wine, but they'll look for something that, and all that does is kind of push it down. And with the prayer, you take your anxiety, and sometimes you don't even know why you're anxious. You're like, what, why? Everything is fine. Why do I have this deep anxiety today? And there's a guy called Peter Kreeft, who's an amazing writer. I think he said that everyone in the world is deeply, 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 deeply unhappy. And we use things to distract ourselves from this deep unhappiness, which he says is rooted in, I think, two things. One is that we know we're going to die. And that, you know, if you're a Christian and you believe in an afterlife, life isn't tragic then, because it's a happy ever after. But if you don't, then life is pretty tragic. And quite frankly, if I didn't think there was a God and there was I wouldn't bother getting out of bed in the morning. What's the point? Because, you know, life can be very, very traumatic. And there's nothing more traumatic than putting someone you love in the ground, covering it up. So there's that. And there's also what he says is this psychic memory, this memory, genetic memory, however you want to, is that once we were like God, we were in paradise. So Genesis tells us you were in the garden, you had everything, and you screwed it up. And we have this fall and this fallen nature. And deep, deep, deep inside of us, we know what we've lost. And we want to get it back. That's what we want. And so this journey is about, you know, coming to know God, who has this amazing plan, who came back as a man, came as a baby man to die for us. He came to teach us how to live, but also to show us the ultimate act of love, taking all this misery on himself and offering it to the Father in the perfect act of love and obedience, and restoring our opportunity to be in paradise again. And So the victory is won, as you say, the victory is won. But why am I not happy? Why am I not completely? Because I'm still on this earth, but I have to patiently endure, share my suffering with Christ, patiently endure until the end. So so to get back to your point about prayer, so instead of seeking the remedy in things that are objectively very good, and Aquinas said there's 4 things that we use to fill that hole in our heart, that empty space: money, power, pleasure, prestige. And so maybe you go into somebody's office and they've got a wall full of awards. That person is probably into honor as a way of, boosting their self-esteem. And we all do it. And I sometimes, probably often, went shopping, spent money, and it distracted me instead of going to sit with the Lord in an hour of adoration and prayer in calm. And that is where you give your problem, your anxiety, your fears to God, and He gives you His peace. And that's when Christ says, I give you my peace. It's a peace the world can't give you. You will not find it. You'll have a little bit of satisfaction for a while in the bar. Might satisfy you to go get those new shoes, the new car, but it doesn't last. Only God lasts. And that joy that comes from knowing and spending time with God, because you become what you worship. So if you worship money, you will be cold and empty, and your money cannot save you. If you worship another person, you become unbalanced because that person can't love you the way you need to be loved, in that unconditional way that only God can give you, the complete acceptance. So we bring your fears, your anxieties, whatever it is bothering you that day, in prayer and before God in silence, you get an answer.
Wow. So I suppose we're headed in a different direction there. Just before, I was going to ask you about your experience with the Sisters of Adoration. So how was that? How did you decide to join that convent in the first place? And
Well,
what was your experience there?
sorry. Well, it's really God's choice. It's God's call. So I got this call, and it's hard to really explain to people who haven't experienced it, except maybe to say it's a little bit like meeting someone. You have this encounter. They're really interested in you. You're not that, I'm very flattered, but you're not my type. But they won't, they go into your brain, and then they're on your mind all the time, and then you get to kind of really like them, and you want to spend more time with them, and then it just grows really deep. And so I just fell very slowly in love with God, with Jesus, who is man and God. And but still I was always kind of like, well, what's in this for me? Like, I don't even know, even if I wanted to give up everything, walk out of my life, I don't even know if I could do that, because I have, financial commitments, personal commitments, family commitments. I have lots of things that kind of tied me to my life. And I liked my life, generally speaking. I wasn't unhappy. And so but I'd gone deeper and deeper into my faith, and I knew God was asking me to do something more. And I was a member of my parish council in the Good Shepherd on the Ormer Road, and we were all asked if we would go to the Living Church. It was the inauguration of the Living Church at the Waterfront Hall that Bishop Noel Traynor had started. Of course, we all kept our head down, including me. I'm like, I'm so busy. I'm going to Italy this weekend. There's no way I'm going. But I agreed to go. As I was leaving the meeting, I felt kind of bad. So I said to Father Paddy, look, I'll go. And next thing you know, I was not only going, but I was chairing a panel discussion, and I was chairing the whole thing. And I was going around, and Peter McVerry, he's a priest that works on the streets of Dublin with the homeless. And was my job to find out what everybody was saying in the workshops and to sum it up at the end of the conference. And when I went into his workshop, he said something that kind of spoke to me, because it was really what was on my mind. Because I always felt, I didn't feel this fear of death. I always felt, gosh, I can't wait to get to the next life. This is something that I really want to do, but obviously I have to live a life here. And he said, if you want your share in the kingdom of God right now, you can do that on earth. You don't have to wait to the next life. So I'm like, well, he said, give up everything and follow Jesus. And I'm like, well, I wouldn't mind my share, but I got a lot of stuff, I got stuff. So the next day I was going to Italy with some friends, and I didn't buy as much stuff as I normally bought. I think I bought like one thing, but normally I'd be coming back with bags. And at the last minute, one of our hotels in Rome was switched, and we ended up staying in a former convent in Trastevere. And the convent had, it was a beautiful hotel. There was still some sisters there. Obviously, vocations crisis, they turned their convent into a hotel. But there was mass in the morning at the reception, there was a little chapel off reception. And my last day there, I went in. And I had been experiencing great levels of joy whenever I took the Eucharist. And sometimes I would have tears, and other times just this elation. And I felt in that moment that, gosh, this is amazing. This is what I want. And when I've been going to Eucharistic adoration, same, on a Monday night at St. Michael's in West Belfast, and it got to the point where I'd rather be there than on TV talking about politics. And when I went home, I had this experience of all my possessions choking me. And I just thought, gosh, I can't go on like this. I have to talk to someone. So I went to talk to the priest who was doing the adoration at St. Michael's on a Monday night, who also turned out was the director of vocations for the diocese. So he signed me up for a retreat. And waiting for 6 months, I signed up to go to Africa, to Zambia with the Salesians as a volunteer, just to see, could I do something like that? And by the time the retreat rolled around in March 2014, I was really kind of enjoying life, and I was enjoying my job at the BBC. I had just come back from Washington, and I had a sense it was my last trip covering the White House. I knew that I probably was going to do this. And when I went on retreat and I was reading scripture, I was meditating on John 4, the woman by the well. And Jesus says to her, if you knew the gift of God, you'd be asking me for a drink. And I was walking around the retreat center in Drummels going, well, what's the gift of God? What's in this for me, Lord? Because, I can't just walk out of this life because there's no going back to it. That much I knew. It had to be sure. And came across this beautiful tree in the garden, and I thought the tree was spectacular. It was late March, and I said, that tree is majestic. But then it came to me that I knew that tree in a few months could be transformed. It could have fruit and leaves. And I knew in that moment that I thought I was being offered transformation. And I thought, yes, that's what I want. I want to be transformed. And I got this great joy. And through my heart, I heard the words, I'm the vine, you're the branches. And whatever you do to the least of these, you do it to me. And in that moment, I knew that the struggle, that it was over. I could either say yes, go to the convent, go to religious life, or go back to the BBC. And I decided I would go to religious life, but I didn't expect the convent of adoration. But there was a sister at the retreat, and someone said, oh, would you not think of joining Sister Eileen's congregation? And I looked at her brown dress and went, no thanks, I'm looking for powder blue. But a couple of weeks later, I went to the convent, which is where I used to drop my mother off on a Saturday while I was going shopping. I'd take her to Clonard, and I went there, and I loved it. I loved the adoration in it. And the more I started going, I realized that that's actually where I was meant to be, not Africa, and so I tried to work up the courage to ask someone, could I come and see?
Yeah. Just on, just as you mentioned, Africa and Zambia, because I saw, I think it was on YouTube, you were mentioning before, what you learned from the people of Zambia in terms of because this is similar. I was talking about this literally yesterday with one of my friends. We went with Habitat for Humanity about 2 years ago it was Malawi, to build houses basically for 10 days or something like that. And we, we went thinking kind of open-minded, open-hearted, but pretty much thinking somewhere in the back of our minds, we're going to go and do something good here, or we're going to help them in some sort of way.
Yeah.
But see what we actually took from being there. It was 10 times more than any. And it rained, by the way, the whole time we were there, so we never really got to actually do much building. But but yeah, just in terms of their pace, the people there's pace of life, and their love and devotion to and for God. I mean, they just lived very much, like if we think of our life now, it's everything's very planned. It's like, this is what I'm doing this weekend. This is what I'm doing at the end of next month. This is what I'm hoping to do 2 and 5 and 12 years from now. Whereas there, it was pretty much just like, listen, the sun's just come up. Let's go live life. And everyone was so jovial and joyous, even though they had absolutely nothing. Like the one thing that we were there for, fair enough, they actually did have a need there in the sense that like their conditions of living were awful. So literally just having a roof over their head massively changed the quality of their lives. But other than that, they had nothing, but they kind of needed nothing. And the funny thing was, we asked them questions. There was one opportunity we had to kind of just literally sit and ask them questions. And some of the people there, and we were asking the stupidest questions. In hindsight, it was like, what would you like to do if you had a different opportunity? Would you like to go to university in the nearest city type thing? But they were looking at you the whole time like, what's wrong with you? They're like,
Yeah.
and you could just sense afterwards, it's like, they're so content, it's not even funny. Like you literally just put a roof over their head, and that's all they needed. So we learned so much from that. And yeah, did you like, what were your experiences when you were in Zambia?
Well, I was only there for 6 weeks, and I was praying before I was going, I found this convent, Lord. Why do I have to go to Zambia? Like, why are you calling me there? Why did you put that in my heart? And what came to me in prayer was, I want you to know my heart. And there's nothing more humble and more beautiful than the heart of an African child. They are so rooted in God and joy and humility. And, they come to me and say, I'm asking for a lollipop. And it's just like, it'll melt your heart. Although after, when I got sick and they're banging the door, I'm like, don't come back here for 2 hours. Yeah. But the gift of God for those who have nothing and are totally dependent on him is joy. Now, you can have that if you are rich, if you have a lot of wealth. If you're not attached to your money and you know that it's a gift from God, it's nothing to do with you, and you use it to help other people. And I suppose for Western culture, we are under this illusion that somehow we're self-sufficient. But what COVID really teaches us is that everything could go in an instant, and that happened with me in the convent. I went there, I never thought I'd be leaving, but because of the fragility of the church, the poverty of the church, the congregation couldn't keep me. And so I lost everything in one day. But what I realized the great gift was, I never lost my relationship with Jesus and my faith, but he has taken care of me at every step. I haven't missed a meal yet. Every time I think, oh gosh, I'm going to pay that bill, the money comes in. And I live like a child, knowing that my father, and at first I was quite anxious about, the not having money, but now it means nothing. I know that I will be provided for. And the children and the people of Africa, I can see it creeping in. I can see it creeping in this Western culture, but they know everything is God on their lips. God is good. They're continually praising. And yes, they have nothing, but they have God who is everything. And when I left the convent, someone said to me, oh, be careful because we live in the age of overwhelm. I said, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, you haven't had a mobile phone for 5 years. You haven't watched television regularly for 5 years. You're going to be like really overcome with noise. And it's true. I had a day where I was full of anxiety and my head hurt. What's wrong? But I'd spent the night before watching Netflix 3 episodes of Madam Secretary, and I realized that was the problem. It was feeding my soul with a lot of garbage because it wasn't life-giving. And I think in Africa it's the same. They're not spending all their time watching TV. They're out in nature. And if you want to know what the first stage really is to knowing God, it's nature, it's wonder.
Obviously, you've just alluded to the fact that you had to, not your own decision, but you had to leave the convent. What were your feelings at the time whenever you heard that information? And although it's not too long ago, there's obviously been some time that's passed now. What are your feelings now?
Well, it was shock when I had to leave, because I was told on the eve of Ash Wednesday, and I was expecting an update on a problem. I was aware of a problem, but I just thought, this is Vatican bureaucracy. Like, I'm called. There's just no way that I'm going to have to leave. So I thought that a creative solution would have been found. And when I was told that actually in 6 months you have to go when your vows run out in 6 months, and you'll be a layperson again, I was really shocked. And I was sent immediately in to pray with the other sisters. There was 4 of us, and we had an hour of adoration. So I think I spent that hour glaring at Jesus, going, I can't believe this, Lord. Because I never, in all my kind of calculations, which were was like, yeah, okay, well, they want me, but if I want them, but, it never occurred to me that they'd want to keep me, I'd want to stay, and someone else would intervene. Yeah. The Lord, really. And so I felt a array of emotions. I mean, I was shocked, and then I had a lot of fear, I suppose. Yeah. Sometimes, not always, but I had a very sleepless night going, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Where will I live? How will I live? And during the course of the night, between praying and kind of full of anxiety and trying to pray my way through it, I realized that even if I won the lottery and I had $1 million in the bank, and I could get a little house by the sea, whatever, while I figured things out, that was no guarantee of security. The banks could collapse. There's no guarantee that I could keep that house. And I thought, my security doesn't lie in anything except the Lord. And he had no place to lay his head. And I knew that he would look after me. So that kind of certainty helped, but it's a roller coaster, because sometimes you're okay, and then the wave of anxiety might come back and you're like, okay. So you have to pray through that, and through a lot of prayer and discernment, I realized that this is what Jesus was asking. So once I realized that, it was okay. If I thought it was, it's a Vatican conspiracy or, an evil plot, but once I realized, actually, this is what Jesus wants. And, here's me, Jesus, only you could call 4 women to a convent in a vocations crisis and then ask them to leave. But that's what he's a wild and crazy guy. So the Lord doesn't think like us. He can see down the road. And so I knew there'd be short-term pain, but I also know it's for a greater good. I don't know exactly where I'm going, but he knows. So that's good enough. There were times, though, when I just wanted to curl up in a ball and at the feet of Jesus in the Adoration Chapel. But you pray through that. And so I grew strong. And so by the time I came to leave, I left with joy. I left on the same day as Elaine Kelly, who was the barrister who joined a couple months before me, and we got to be friends in the convent. And we were reading scripture, and it said, he sent them out in pairs. So we thought, right, we'll stick together. We went immediately on holiday to Florida. I said, well, I prayed for a miracle, and here I am on a beach in Florida. The Lord has his ways, his consolations. But I suppose it's been quite a journey, and it hasn't been easy, because you really, it is a cross. And I have really learned to rely on Jesus in a way that I never would have in the convent, when, everything's provided, in the sense that, you don't really have to think about, how you're going to make a living, because you're so focused on prayer, because all those things, that's the beauty of religious life. You want to just focus totally on God. And so you're not really distracted by what other people have to deal with. But I remember someone said to me, it must be great, you don't have to pay any bills in there. And I'm like, you pay with your will. You pay with your will, because there's times when you don't really feel like doing what you're being asked to do, but you do it. Yeah. And that's the same in any vocation. People get married and they're like, I don't really feel like going to your parents' house today, but you go, because that's part of the commitment. So yeah, it's been a gift. I've had a lot of help. Elaine and I've had help from the church, really, from the people in the church. The church is the laity, and it's the people in the church who go to Mass who have helped us. And so it was a friend of our families have been there, of course, but the week before we were due to leave, a woman who had come to the convent had befriended us, befriended the congregation, was so upset when she heard that we were leaving. She said, I have a house in Downpatrick. That's how we ended up in Downpatrick. Then about 6 months after that, was kind of thinking, gosh, I got to find a mission. I got to find a purpose. I can't just sit on the couch watching Murder, She Wrote. And so when I was praying to St. Patrick, I said, St. Patrick, I need a mission. And I come out of Mass on Saturday morning at St. Patrick's, and I went into the church shop to buy prayer cards of St. Patrick to give out on St. Patrick's Day in a couple of weeks' time. And I was going back in, holding these prayer cards to go back into adoration when I was stopped by this man who was on the board of St. Patrick's Center. And he said, are you Martina Purdy? And I said, yes. He said, would you like to do some writing for the center? And I'm like, yes. I'm going, this is the fastest answer to a prayer I've ever had. And the following Monday, we met, and I ended up a part-time job, as kind of part-time position. It's not a job, it's a contract, as their PR person. And then the third thing I wrote was they were closing for COVID. But then during COVID, Elaine and I started walking around Downpatrick, and we developed a pilgrim route, a walk to all the holy sites. And the center helped with that. Dr. Tim Campbell, who's the center director, and we have a passport. And the Camino is a really great way to talk to people about God. Most people are curious about God, even if they're on a scenic route thinking they're, driving away from him, they're curious. Mm-hmm. And so they come, and most people who come are people of faith, but sometimes they profess atheism, and that's fine. I don't believe in atheists because I know that eventually they'll lose their faith in their atheism and then be back to believing in God.
So you have exactly as long as that walk is in order to convince them otherwise. But yeah, so when are you starting that up this year? I think you mentioned before that it's not starting up in a few weeks.
Yeah, on the 25th, the 26th of May, the last Wednesday and Thursday, I might get my dates wrong. The last Wednesday and Thursday in May, we're starting the Downpatrick Walk. And then on the 14th of June, we are doing the new coastal route, which is really the most beautiful walk that we have. And it's 7 miles from Ballyhornan to St. Patrick's Ancient Well in Sheepland, all along this amazing coast that most people don't know about, including me. I used to go to the Antrim coast. Yeah. And you stop at Sheepland, then you go to Ard Toll, and then into Ardglass to the golf club for lunch. And we talk about, Patrick and the heritage, but it's mostly about the walk and the beauty of it.
Yeah, I'll have to get up in a few weeks.
Well, do come. You're welcome to come, Luke, as our guest. I would recommend I'd recommend the coastal one, but you can do any one you want. We also have canoeing now, canoeing on the Coil, and a walk to St. Patrick's First Church, his grave, and we do St. Patrick's Way, Newcastle, and we're introducing a few more routes. And we think that people are hungry for beauty, and beauty is a great way to come to goodness, which is a great way to come to the truth. So everyone has a different path of discovering who God is on that very personal way. But, the way in the Camino of Santiago really started, it's ancient, but it really became very popular in the 1970s. People started to go, and it's just kind of taken off. So who knows where this will lead, but it's what we're doing for now.
Yeah. We might have the same tropical weather, but potentially at the end of May and early June. You never know.
Well, there's a downside to tropical weather. There's bugs. So the worst thing that happens is it rains. And we curse the rain that gives us life. But when the weather is amazing, we realize you can't really do it in the rain because people don't want to get soaked. So we cancel it with a rain date. We give people a rain date. But yeah, it's a great experience. And Patrick, it's the cradle of Christianity. And it's where Patrick began his mission. And there's something special about that, especially for Christians to come and see. Yeah.
100%. I just want to sort of finish with asking you two slightly more challenging contemporary issues type questions. Because I know, and for those of you that are on Twitter, Martina's got a Twitter account and is quite active on it. And it's good to engage with all these different challenges that we're seeing in our current in our modern world. But just even locally, now this point, I suppose, applies to anywhere in the world really now, but I heard a discussion just specifically looking at the political landscape in Northern Ireland yesterday on the radio, where it was basically, I'm not sure, Pastor Paul, I'm not sure surname, not a Protestant church pastor anyway, was talking about how the people of Northern Ireland, north of Ireland, Belfast and the surrounding fields, as I like to call it, they are a Christian people. You know, whether or not that may be Catholic or Protestant, regardless of the denomination. And he was talking about there needing to be more of a political representation that focuses on upholding Christian morals, principles, and values. And I actually, in one of my last podcasts, had on Carla Lockhart from the DUP. Because she's involved with a number of different pro-life initiatives. And it wasn't even during the podcast. It was like after we'd finished recording, we were just chatting for 10 minutes. And I was saying, look, Carla, it's hard for me personally, specifically trying to move towards my Catholic faith. That the kind of the political parties, which would historically be more associated with people from a Catholic background here, would be pretty much Sinn Féin for the most part, and sort of SDLP. And those two parties, I would argue, and certainly Sinn Féin, are probably more at odds, I would say, with Catholic and Christian teaching than most of the other parties. You know, even the DUP, for different faults that it has, it kind of upholds Christian values. So I suppose my question is, like, what are your thoughts on this in general? But do you think there is potentially a need for some form of Christian party which could potentially cross party lines? You know, be they nationalist unionist?
Well, there is a need, in my view, for a party that it will attract people who want their society to reflect their values. And I'm disappointed, certainly, in the way that the political parties here, with few exception, have embraced abortion. And for me, it's a lack of education. And it's a formation really in the media. You know, the media gives you a false sense of compassion. And then you hear people who are supposed to be, Catholic, solid Catholic, saying it's not compassionate to, it's someone's, I wouldn't have one myself, but I think it's a personal thing, and that's a very lazy way of thinking. And if they actually thought it through, they would realize that. But it's the way society is now, and Catholic values, Christian values, which were rooted in our laws, going back to Constantine. So the Roman Empire was a pagan empire. Constantine adopted Christianity, and the Christianity then came with the law and imposed. But that's gone. And Christians cannot impose their morality. They can propose. So people say to me, oh, mind your own business. I said, but I'm being asked to pay for an abortion in a healthcare system. So I do have an opinion as a voter, and I'm entitled to that. So we have to work to persuade. And it'll only change if the voters themselves put the pressure on. I'm not sure that I'd be uncomfortable with kind of Christians, a Christian party per se, because I think the kingdom of God is what we're interested in. But we live in this society, so we want to build kingdom values into the society we live in. But we can't impose our views. Yeah. But I do think we have to get better at persuading people, because a lot of these people are good people. But if they went, in my view, to witness an abortion, they change their mind. But they have been inculcated with values that say the child has been dehumanized. It's not a baby. Everybody knows it's a baby. But when we're talking about abortion, the child is dehumanized. It's a fetus. But you don't congratulate someone on having a fetus, or I'm about to have a fetus. I'm 6 months on this fetus. It's a child. And I think that that's where we have failed, and that's where it really is rooted in a failure to explain why, as Christians, it's wrong. Why it's wrong to kill a child. I mean, the Romans would have left baby at the side of the road unwanted, and take your chances. Maybe someone will find it. But now we know what's wrong, so we dress it up as healthcare. But this is a very cynical abortion industry. It's all about profit. Mm-hmm. And the first suffragettes said that abortion is the ultimate exploitation of women. So I don't think necessarily we need a Christian party. We need Christians who will go to their politicians and say, I'm not happy and I'm not going to vote for you. And there's people in parties who've said to me, oh, but I personally, I don't support it. It's the leadership. I said, look, if you're still in that party, you do support it tacitly. If you really, truly believe that abortion was wrong, it was a crime against humanity, you'd resign. So what's more important to you? And one of the big challenges for all politicians, and it's for everyone, accountants, journalists, is you cannot be a Catholic by night and a politician by day. The values that you say that you believe and espouse, and you have to live. And that's hard. That's hard. That's going to cost you. Mm-hmm. So what I would think is that Christians have to get better at proposing. And when you give people a rational argument, I tend to not necessarily talk about Christianity being the reason that I don't support abortion. I just say, look, rationally, we now, the science now tells us this is a unique person. We can see, and then you have Richard Dawkins in his ignorance saying that someone with Down syndrome, it's better to abort because they're going to suffer. And you're kind of like, well, you might as well abort everybody then. Because everybody, to live is to suffer. And you could be saying, well, that person's about to have a really healthy child, but by the time they're 15, they're addicted to crack cocaine and they're tormenting their parents. Children with Down syndrome bring a lot of gifts. So it's about educating people. And a lot of the problem is that in years ago, people with Down syndrome were not given any help or support. They're put in institutions. And so a lot of the research is based on someone being left to just with no love. So when you help people, it's amazing what people with Down syndrome can do, and they bring gifts. Yeah. And they don't get addicted to drugs, and they don't bring the pain that a lot of so-called, healthy children bring their parents. So I really think the problem is that a lot of good people out there are not educated. And I have to say that I went to when I was a Sister of Adoration, I knew I was pro-life, but I didn't know all the arguments. But when I went to hear Lord Alton give a lecture, it was really interesting because I could see people from different political parties that I'd never seen in a Catholic church hall, members of the DUP, coming to listen to this guy. He gave you every rational argument that you needed. And actually, he was very persuasive. So I think we just have to go into the public square and explain our position, because our position is right. It's truth. It's life-giving, and people will listen.
100%.
I hope.
No, that was great. Thanks for that. So then it would be remiss of me not to ask as well, slightly different subject area, but with your experience working in media, you mentioned there that the media doesn't do a great job in terms of a pro-life perspective whenever it comes to this particular issue. But more generally, what are your thoughts on media at the moment, kind of globally and more locally, in terms of the quality? Because for myself, I mentioned to you before we started recording that one of the reasons I started doing this channel was to try and get some more authentic information out there in relation specifically to things that I'm interested in and have some experience in relation to finance and the economy. And I just don't feel like it's being covered effectively. And what I see in that area, it's now everything's agenda driven to some or other degree, but it's too heavy in terms of pushing certain agendas. And it seems to me like a lot of the media at the moment is just hand in hand with the government, different government proposals and things that they're pushing. So do you have any thoughts in relation to that? And just lastly on that as well, did you notice during your time working in the media and journalism whether there was a sort of shift in that direction from more pure journalism as opposed to being told like this is kind of the story that we want to achieve?
Well, I don't think you're going to ever get journalism in its purest form, because you're dealing with individuals who are flawed and they have their own views. But where I think that some journalists take seriously the fact that they're supposed to be objective. And did I always manage to be objective? Probably not. But I wouldn't have survived at the BBC and then journalism as long as I had if I wasn't at least doing my best to do that, and keeping in mind as I went along what my biases were, and not following my own agenda, and saying, right, well, I have to be fair here. So I always wanted to be fair. I didn't want to only tell one side of the story. But there is kind of this creeping that I can see, and it's not in all journalism, this creeping notion that you don't have to be objective because you're right. Or, it's particularly bad in America. When I was in Florida, I couldn't watch CNN or Fox because it was just constant opinion, constant opinion. And it takes a lot of time and resources to chase up a story and thoroughly investigate it. And in fairness to journalism, there's fewer resources. Everything is speed, 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 get out there, get the story. And really, what it reduces to sometimes is a celebrity culture of, I think I saw somewhere where Hugh Grant went to a bakery, and who cares? He was spotted at a bakery, and this was really
Amen to that.
who cares? And what he had. And so we've got this kind of culture of celebrity. We've got, you have a very well-resourced business, very well-resourced political parties who have got spin doctors, and you have fewer and fewer journalists. And the problem I see with politics generally, and you could see that in the lobby, say at Washington or London, is that these journalists need to be in the good graces of the political powers that be, or they will not be included. And this has always been a problem in journalism. The closer you are to your source, you will get access, but you have to compromise. And I remember Ben Bradley from the Washington Post saying he got too close to the Kennedys. He actually, I think, was in the hospital room when they were operating on him, something like that. And he said, as he was leaving, Jackie Kennedy, he was a frequent dinner guest to their house, hugged him and said, "You will not report this." And I thought, and I found for myself was, what is the point of being close to these people if you can't report? So I'd rather be on the outside and maybe not getting those kind of stories that you get that exclusive interview on the night somebody quits. I would rather not pay the price that requires is that. And so I feel that I didn't want to be a stenographer. And sometimes, you have a situation, say, if the person needs access to this politician, and they forget that the politician needs the media more than the media needs a politician, but it requires everybody to play that game. But if a couple of colleagues are willing to turn a blind eye, report what the party wants, you're in trouble. It's compromised. So I always had this saying which I learned in journalism school. Journalists have contacts, they don't have friends. And so when someone would come to me as a politician and say something, I'd say, "I'm not your friend. I'm sorry. You're my contact. I cannot do you this favor if you like." Most people knew the game, but I think the game has been compromised, and that's partly because the people who feed the media are becoming increasingly sophisticated, and the media has less time. And also there's kind of this woke culture of, and media does tend to be probably more left-wing, more, and this cancel culture. And the media has to take some responsibility for that. And, I remember someone saying to me, the London tabloids would be the modern equivalent of being stoned to death. People's reputations are gone, but people who do are never one thing. And so I think you have to be careful too that you have the pursuit of truth, yes, and I no longer had the stomach for that sometimes, because I started to think about the consequences of my reports, and it's a very important job to be there, telling the truth, exposing. But someone's going home and having a bad day. Now, I always tried to steer clear of anything that was personal. I always only was really, what are they doing at Stormont today in terms of spending money, things like that. But it's a bit of a brutal game now. You can be really, really savaged in the media, and where people can't come back from it. Someone said, Winston Churchill was one of my father's heroes, would never survive the modern media because it's so much access now. And probably the headline would be Churchill drunk again. It's very, but then are you electing perfect people, or are you electing people who can do the job? And that puts a lot of good people off because they're not saints. None of us are.
Yeah.
So it's a complex question. I mean, but I looked at the American election. Quite frankly, the media didn't do itself any favors. And you might really dislike someone, and they might be obnoxious, but you still have to do your job. Whereas, looking at some of the coverage, it was, people, some politicians were getting a bye ball. And that's why I think this new media, where people are taking control and saying, I want to ask questions that aren't being asked, that's taking off. But that also has its problems. I think my blood ran cold the first time I heard the word citizen journalists, because there's a lot more than just maybe taking some pictures and posting them. You have to be able to have context, and pictures do lie. You have to have context. So I think really good training, but there is a school of journalism that says befriend this person and get the access and get headlines. And you see that with particular people who masquerade as journalists, say in American television, and they're asking questions, but they're all easy questions. It's not, they don't actually ask the hard questions. So it's always a balancing act. But I think that if you're going to be a journalist, you're not going to have friends, not in the people you're interviewing. You can be pleasant, but they're not your friend.
100%. All right, Martina, I think I've taken way more of your time than I probably originally said that I would. So thanks so much for your time today. That was wonderful. And more generally, thank you for your witness. And let's hope we get this faith train back in the rails and heading in the right direction.
Well, thank you for yours. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. I'm very happy to talk about Jesus. It's my favorite topic. So, and you must come as my guest, as our guest on the way. You'd be very welcome. So, okay.
All right. Thank you, Martina. God bless you.
Thanks. Bye.
Well, folks, I thoroughly enjoyed that. I really hope you did as well. Thanks again to Martina for coming on and having the chat. And make sure if you're in this part of the world to check out the St. Patrick's Centre and potentially go for one of those really cool coastal walks throughout the town of Downpatrick and learn a bit about our history here and the history of the church in St. Patrick here. For more authentic conversations and challenging information, I would invite you to subscribe. And much love. God bless. Keep the faith.